Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Mr. Peter Villano, who works at Microsoft and is a director at the Microsoft Innovation and Policy Center in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on national security and emerging technology policy challenges. Prior to joining Microsoft, Pete served for more than a decade as a professional staff member on the House Armed Services Committee, also known as the HASC, and advised members of Congress on issues related to cyber operations and policy, information technologies, counterterrorism, special operations, intelligence programs, and related interagency activities. He was the principal staff author of groundbreaking artificial intelligence legislation, including the creation of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and was a recent recipient of the Fed 100 Award for 2020 from Federal Computer Weekly for his contributions in information technology and cyber warfare. He has also served in senior staff positions at the US State Department and is a former naval officer with service in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen, leading specialized explosive ordnance disposal or bomb squad teams. Pete Villano, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
I'd like to start our conversation with a 10,000 foot level tour of what it means to be a congressional staffer. There's two chambers of Congress, the House and the Senate, and I would imagine that each of those chambers has lots of supporting infrastructure to help those operations stay up and running and do the work of the American people. Could you tell our audience who might be a little unfamiliar with what it means to be a staffer and just give a general tour of what that space looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And my experience is just like you said, we're on the House of Representatives side of Congress. And I worked within a defense committee that essentially oversees all of the funding and all of the related areas, including policy and authorities, national security issues for the Department of Defense, major portions of the intelligence community, and even portions of the Department of Energy. And professional staff are there as part of the committee, and effectively are there as senior advisors. They own portfolios, they own issues, develop expertise in those areas so that they can help the members stay sharp on issues and help the members legislate. And the principal defense bill, the annual must pass, as it's called, is the National Defense Authorization Act. And that's functionally the bill that I helped support it every year. In terms of building pieces of legislation to help the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, and to help members understand those issues. So, as professional staff, you are working for the committee. You're working for either the chairman on the majority party or the ranking member as the minority party. I actually worked and served for both major political parties when I was there. So, professional staff a lot of times are also, they advise in a political environment. Obviously, it's Capitol Hill, but they also develop substantive expertise as far as the committees are concerned, develop, good, solid, substantive expertise to be able to advise in a whole slew of issues. And like you said earlier, the areas that I worked on were all within functionally what's called the Intelligence, Emerging Threats, and Capabilities Subcommittee. And this is the subcommittee that is dedicated to cover cyber operations, emerging technologies, all of the policy issues related with information technology and programs, intelligence programs, interagency activities. Information warfare is a big piece of that, as well as counterterrorism and even countering weapons of mass destruction, counterproliferation, if you will, in that sense. So you're really, as professional staff, you're a trusted advisor. That's really what you're doing, and you're advising in a very, congested and crowded political space. You spend a lot of time, obviously, with members, helping them understand issues, but you also spend a lot of time out and about and learning from and learning inside the Pentagon, learning inside different agencies. Frankly, international travel. I was very lucky to travel abroad, frankly, more times than I can count, between Somalia and Seattle, all the way, to Iraq, Afghanistan, through several other parts of Africa, through Eastern Europe, and Asia as well. So, and you do that to interface with U.S. embassies, to interface with military servicemen and women that are overseas on assignments, on missions, and helping understand the challenges that they are facing, so that you can then help craft policy as effectively as it can be back in the committee through that annual national defense bill process.
Thanks a lot. What years were you on the Hill again?
So I started in very early 2010, and I just retired. I finished in March of 2020, this past March.
Wow. So you're there during a interesting period, especially related to the information environment, the cyber environment. We are in a period where lots of experts agree that the United States' superiority in the kinetic world, or in the technological national security world, those relative advantages that the United States has had over the last, during the post-Cold War period, say since 1990, those relative advantages are may still be evident, but there are new threats which completely blow away those technological and kinetic advantages. And so you were on the Hill during the last 10 years, where I suppose there was a gradual dawning amongst the political class and the Department of Defense that, hang on, we've got a threat emerging here that is something potentially that we were rather unprepared for. Could you talk a little bit about that, taking the shades off of our eyes, and how, at least from a HASC and staffer perspective, you saw this unfold?
Yeah, absolutely, John. And I mean, you characterized it exactly right in terms of that sort of decade, if you will, and the changes that happened. And, when you consider 2010 and how engaged we were still in the wars in the Middle East, and the force that had been built, to fight those wars and continue to fight global counterterrorism operations, but essentially a very, kinetically focused force. And in the meantime, the combination of the portfolio that I helped manage, and at times, of course, had a team really, most importantly, helping manage this, certainly from my perspective, is congressional staff constantly need to work together, definitely on the committee side, to understand these issues and seams. We had the ability to understand and see things that were also happening in the information warfare space, in the nation state actor side. This was also the time, we were, the department was standing up and considering Cyber Command and a whole slew of different changes throughout the force with respect to cyber warfare, cyber operations. You had each of the military services, coming to understand those challenges and thickening their forces and capabilities. And yet it was still, overwhelmingly, they're still, to a very large degree, certainly when you consider traditional psychological operations, military information support operations, Special Operations Command plays a very big role in all of that. and a very effective command at the time still had been, very much focused on counterterrorism, and a large portion of the force, rightfully so. That was the mission that was, being directed and asked. A large portion of the force, including in the cognitive space, was predominantly about counterterrorism, very tactical, surgical sort of activities to help the force, to influence the battle space, to protect the force in a lot of different ways. So a lot of the oversight that we did was, and still is, the committee is still the framework to understand operations, understand the gaps if the military is being asked to do a certain activity, doesn't have the authorities. Those types of conversations were constantly being had. There was a portion where, the 2015, 2016 timeframe where, more and more the nation state influence activities. And obviously this is, by the time the election in 2016 comes around, 2018, we all know this crescendo now. But a large part of the Department of Defense authorities were still focused only on counterterrorism, countering violent extremists. So the conversation began about 2014, 2015, in terms of how not just the department, but working in coordination with the State Department, and in particular, a newer organization that had emerged around that same time, which was the Global Engagement Center, how the department could work with the Global Engagement Center to help in different ways influence the information environment, contribute to the national security pieces in areas outside of Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, other Middle East sort of focused countries. And that those authorities weren't there, in terms of how do we counter Russian influence? How do we counter Chinese influence coming from China? How do we deal with, other nation state issues? To empower European Command, US European Command, working with the State Department, regionally working with each of those different embassies. So it began a conversation to open up the aperture and have that state aspect with State Department in the lead, the nation state aspect, I should say, with US State Department in the lead and Global Engagement Authority being central to that.
So you mentioned the Global Engagement Center. What governmental agency does that belong to?
Yeah, so it resides in the State Department. It is actually, it's an area that, even though I had the Defense Committee portfolio that was covering military and related sort of intelligence activities in the information environment, we didn't have authority over the State Department Global Engagement Center, which is what was stood up. But it is functionally, it's in the State Department. It's in a headquartered element. It is, it's staffed interagency. There are regional experts, and it is in place and has been in place now to coordinate the messaging as far as inform and influence goes.
I see. I want to rewind just a little bit. You mentioned a couple of terms that I want to ask you if you could just define what those are for people in our audience that might not be as familiar, but congressional oversight and congressional authorities. Could you explain just a little bit what each of those are and how they fit into this discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. And the oversight, it's a great question, because those two words definitely are, they mean different things to different people. Oversight this is how, the defense committees in Congress does their job. It's their charge. They are designed to, and it is constitutionally, they organize and help, write the laws that provide the funding, that provide the legal authorities, if you will, for military operations and activities. And that is, it is also approving the annual budgets and the annual authorizations and appropriations, literally the permissions, if you will, and the checks that are written and can be cashed come from the authorizing committees and the appropriations committees. And in doing that, it is oversight is done, if you will. It's the conversation back and forth that takes place between, in our case from HASC, it takes place with the Pentagon and the intelligence community, and it takes place understanding what those dollars are doing, how they're doing it. Is it meeting congressional intent? What the defense committees wrote the law to say? Is the Pentagon doing that? All those things. Is it in line with the national strategy? And that's, everyone knows, committee hearings, congressional hearings. It takes place also informally with briefings to staff, briefings to members. And it takes place as well with travel, as I talked about earlier. A large part of getting out and about inside, the offices and buildings, but also, frankly, overseas to see that. And then when I talk about authorities, I'm talking, and certainly within the context that I was describing, how large portions of the activities were informant influence and information warfare was, for counterterrorism operations. There were laws that allowed the Department of Defense to do that, and manning, training, and equipping, and funding and dollars flowing to allow them to do that. When they wanted to do something against Russia, for example, they didn't necessarily have the ability to do that, to either partner, for example, like is going on now in Eastern Europe, or Estonia is one of the recent ones where there's cyber operations partnering happening, and that includes a whole slew of different things. So those permissions and authorities had to be granted in law at times. Sometimes the department has the ability to expand their own not authorities but permissions, if you will, through ex orders or other things that can direct the force. But generally speaking, when there's a big shift such as that, it does require a change in law. So those authorities have to be looked at and considered, and oftentimes literally a law must be passed to do that, and that takes place in the National Defense Authorization Act. And this, in this case, this was to give the Global Engagement Center literally authority for state information and propaganda to be able to go after that, to counter foreign state and as well as non-state propaganda and disinformation efforts. That are continuing to undermine and influence U.S. policy and national security.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for that. That 101 about congressional oversight and congressional authorities. But before we recorded, we went over a few things, and you were telling me about two authorities in general. There's Title 10 and Title 50, which are especially relevant to information warfare and operations in the cyber environment. Could you talk a little bit about those authorities? And is there another authority that's been created for the Global Engagement Center, or does Title 10 and Title 50 kind of combine at the State Department level? So just take that in any direction you'd like, please.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's a great question. I'll focus, like I said earlier, just kind of on my experiences. When we talk about Title 10 and Title 50, it is, it's always used as a shorthand reference between what the Department of Defense does and what other agencies, including the CIA, can do and does. And with respect to Title 10, which is where I have worked and lived mostly, it is, as I like to say, Admiral Olson, the former U.S. SOCOM commander, used to call Title 10 psychological operations and military operations. He called it truth-telling with a purpose. And it really is informing and influencing different activities with those military tools, obviously not kinetic, but using information operations and all the details that Major Ash Holtzman talked about, frankly, on your last podcast, in terms of how it's even being done today and what is going on. And then, Title 50 really does refer to those other activities conducted by the U.S. government, including CIA, and what they do on the intelligence covert action side. That being an area of sensitivity, but still it's a tool, and it is an authority that is open and out there in terms of what our intelligence community can do versus the military. In some ways, when you talk Title 50 and Title 10, certainly for me, as I think about the work we did, it brings up a lot of the challenges in terms of how difficult operating in the information space can be and what our tools are. And sometimes those tools are divided and separated. We may not have holistic plans, have holistic coordination in just the same way. That the information operations space is very clouded in the field and very clouded in the world. It's also, it can be very difficult in terms of congressional oversight with what the committees can see and what the committees are doing.
Great, thanks. And I encourage listeners to go back and check out Ash Holtzman's podcast that Pete just mentioned. He tells a number of interesting stories about black ops and those types of things that are not discussed too often out in the open. So, Pete, so you have obviously been distilling a lot of complicated interactions on the Hill, a lot of very fluid national security situation unfolding. And you've been trying to simplify it, but even in this simplified version, it gets complicated rather quickly. So the interplay between Congress and the Pentagon and the Department of State, other governmental agencies that play roles in this whole area, how do you see that evolving over time, and what challenges does our bureaucracy or our trying to figure this out in real time, what challenges does that impose upon us as we find ourselves in the middle of this cognitive borderless battle space below the level of armed conflict?
It's such a great question, John, and it goes to describe the complexity of the world today and what has happened and the pace at which this is happening. Information and information technology and the explosion of so many different, social media issues and a whole slew of different things. In fact, you wrote a paper on this with respect to information warfare and the, how difficult it is an information warfare arms race being underway, requiring near-time capabilities, to identify malicious social media accounts, control the information environment, a whole slew of things. But it is, so many of these challenges, what makes it difficult is that, when you consider what the military can do, what the State Department can do, what the Central Intelligence Agency can do, it has to be coordinated. It has to be an interagency game, and there has to be a strategy in terms of defining a way forward. So much of the challenges right now are because technology and information and data and the ability to manipulate data and information, the volume, but also the ability to target specifically, makes it a strategic risk. And it's even more of a risk because the technology is outpacing the policy. And that imbalance right there just, really makes it all the more important that, an interagency coordination has to happen. There is still so many challenges and so many different seams because arguably we have, when you consider the Pentagon, a force that is largely built for conventional capabilities and challenges, but also a force that is largely still now is a force that was built years ago for a counterterrorism mission, for a irregular warfare type mission, not necessarily the information warfare challenges that we're seeing today. to include, the military will not be and may not be the best and first tool to handle a lot of these things as well. The interagency really, with NSC direction, national security, pieces that are tied in at that presidential level also have to really be coordinated and pushed. So it's a hard answer. It's a hard, it's a hard, I should say it's a great question, but not a good answer just in terms of the overall challenges that are there. But the pace of technology and the lag in policy is really such a challenge. And it's frankly one of the reasons why I still, am working in the policy space in this sense, because it is really, I think, a generational challenge that we are facing now.
Well, totally concur with that. And some experts assert, this is to your provocative point just a moment ago, that the Department of Defense or the military might of the United States and the West may not be, it will not be, I guess, the only show in town when it comes to countering the information and the cognitive threat. And other information warfare experts assert that, done correctly, and I suppose you could take this all the way back to Sun Tzu, right? If done correctly, operations in the information environment could preclude the necessity of armed conflict. And so we should definitely be figuring out ways to protect the homeland, protect our national security interests, while trying to minimize the last resort, which is, kinetic conflict.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, our greatest risk right now as a country, as a government is moving too slow in a lot of ways. And, the pace of innovation is not going to slow down. I see it firsthand every day in my current job. It is not slowing down. It is exponentially speeding up. Wow. And fortunately, we are, as a country, we are an engine of that. And we, at least for the time being, certainly these are geopolitical challenges, but we are certainly still an engine of innovation. But the work to manage that innovation on the policy side, really does need to speed up, and that includes our interagency national security community to work hard at being able to have options as a government and being able to present options.
Yeah, that's good advice to any governmental policymakers listening to this. Please take heed to Pete's suggestions there. I don't want to put you on the spot here, Pete, but I'd love to get your insider take. So, we're recording this at the end of 2020. It's been one heck of a year. But I think most political watchers are asserting these days that it seems like there's, partisan rancor is at an all-time high. Well, this is not a partisan podcast, and I don't want to make it into one. However, I would love to get your perspective on, does the tenor of discussion change? Do you notice anything different commingling with representatives from different sides of the aisles, behind closed doors, in smaller meeting spaces? Is there a difference in the way they interact compared to when they're standing in front of a microphone talking to the chattering class?
Yeah, I enjoyed working on the Defense Committee and the House Armed Services Committee in particular. Incredibly challenging, a unbelievably rewarding experience as well. But one of the real reasons was that this is a committee, including the counterpart, the Senate Armed Services Committee on the Senate side. These are committees that legislate every year, and in doing that, it requires cooperation. It requires bipartisan work. The members that go to those committees are either, defense experts in issues in their own right. A lot have served we had former CIA officers. We had, and there still are, we had former military officers. Generally speaking, they are, if they have not worn the uniform or served in government themselves, they are policy experts and have military bases and have, a real reason to legislate. But what I did constantly notice, quite frankly, was that they are focused on outcomes and focused on legislating, and they have to be. They go to those committees to do that, specifically HASC and the SASC, which is the Senate Armed Services Committee, because there's an annual process. It is demanded of them in terms of the need to have personnel authorities, for example, re-extended. Different funding shifts that have to happen, different policy emphasis points. So I frankly always found it refreshing in a lot of ways, because even though there would be difficult debates and arguments, like there should be when you're talking about hard policy issues, ultimately, these were really, policy hard debates trying to get to the bottom, less politics. And it's a political environment these days. Politics pushes into everything, but, resoundingly, the national security focus always takes, priority. And you hear members say that, you hear them say that in the open. And frankly, certainly from my experiences, they really, dedicate themselves to a lot of that. So yeah, I appreciate the question.
Well, that's good to know, especially in light of all of the challenges that you were just recapping for us. At least if those men and women are aligned in mission, at least but behind closed doors. That's good to know.
And I'll add to one other thing, and I think I said this before. I worked for both political parties when I was there. And just the fact that staff can do that on a defense committee, sends a message in terms of, the bipartisanship that is, to a certain degree in the fiber of a committee that needs to do that. So I offer that as an example, and as well as even, different members that coordinate issues and initiatives back and forth from both sides of the aisle. And the defense bill that just came out, passed the House the other day, 355 votes in favor, 77 or so, I think, against. But just, the overwhelming votes in favor of the defense bill shows, House of Representatives commitment, and the Senate, I think, will follow suit here shortly with a strong vote like that too. So
good to know. As you know, I like to ask our guests if they could recommend a couple of additional reading materials that interested listeners can go and check out if they'd like to have a deeper dive into some of these things that we've been discussing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It was hard to single out a few, but I have two, if that's okay. And one has guided me a lot over the years. This one is called a Fierce Domain: Conflict in Cyberspace, from 1986 to 2012. Several authors, but Jason Healy, former Air Force and now at Columbia University, is the author or the editor of this. But Fierce Domain really is I enjoyed reading this. I still reference it. It talks literally about how conflict in cyberspace has changed and how we as a country have dealt with that, including the militarization, if you will, in different ways, but also a whole slew of different interagency changes and different challenges that have come about through the years. And then the second one is, and my Microsoft colleagues will probably rib me for this, written by two folks from Microsoft, Tools and Weapons: The Promise and Peril of the Digital Age, written by Brad Smith and Carol Ann Brown. Brad is the president of the company, but this is a transformative book for me. And I read this actually when I was still in government and still with the committee. But, Brad really here and Carol Ann, they lay out a large part of what I was describing before, just in terms of the pace of technology and how fast things are moving, and how the policy absolutely needs to keep pace. across the board. So really transformative book for me, super helpful to understand as well the next 5 to 10 years and the challenges ahead. So I enjoyed both of those. So wanted to offer up two, if that's okay.
Peter Villano, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks a lot, John. I really appreciate it. Had fun. Thank you.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.